Hello there. I've been teaching for 17 years now. I did my CELTA in Bangkok, and I began my teaching career in public schools over there in Thailand. Now, incidentally, there are a lot of problems with the CELTA, but I was actually really glad that I did it because, in my opinion, it's the best pre-service qualification that an EL teacher can get by a wide margin. It was incredibly stressful, and there was far too much information and concepts for me to process without really having any context for it. Now, I didn't really know how I passed, but I just worked very hard on it and got a little help from some other colleagues on the course. It's all a bit of a blur, really. However, I did pick up a hell of a lot, which got me off to a really good start teaching. I had some sound teaching techniques in my toolkit, but to be honest, I didn't really have any sense of the deeper understanding of how languages are learned or any kind of strategic sense of what I was trying to achieve. It was, if I'm honest, more of a rigid checklist of teaching acts that you just have to perform. In any case, I felt like it put me way ahead of the average teacher that was turning up with, a kind of Mickey Mouse TEFL certificate and skimming an even smaller surface to the one that I'd explored. So I felt pretty cocky about myself at the time. I always kind of felt like it was a testament to the character of the new teacher that they absolutely did the best they could to get the best training before they actually started, as opposed to these kind of cheap fly-by-night TEFL certificates that don't really prepare the teacher for anything. So because of that, I've always had an enormous amount of respect for people that had a CELTA, even if I do have some misgivings about the course itself, which I do. In particular, the way that the qualification intersects with an industry that's resigned to textbook-driven ELT and tends to ignore the findings of the last 30 years of second language acquisition research. But let's put that to one side for now. I'll explore that in future videos. So just by giving that introduction, I'm really not trying to say that I'm in any way superior to other teachers. Some teachers are just kind of less informed, and lots of people start out with a basic TEFL and actually become great teachers. And I think it's really important that I add that point. Because once I'd gotten my certificate and I started teaching, I really felt like I was qualified, and I didn't really need to do much more. It's just because the job I was in, I was basically coasting along like everybody else. Like most other foreign teachers, I wanted to absorb the experience and explore and change. And yes, to some extent, I did kind of view my job and my teaching work. Yes, it was important, but also, more importantly at the time, although I cared about my job teaching, it was very much secondary to the experience of living in a new culture, getting away from the UK, having an amazing life. And I think this is where most teachers are, and that's fine. But if you stick with it for long enough, hopefully, a sense of professionalism kind of grows on you over time when you realize that you're just kind of going through the motions a little bit and doing what's expected of you, knowing full well that best practice ELT teaching involves doing so much more, so much better. So in that regard, I'm very much a late bloomer, and I have to be honest about that up front. Going back to the CELTA for a moment, I just felt like one of the problems was that it raised your baseline expectation of the importance of teaching language and putting the learners first and, sort of applying the best possible methods to achieve those aims. But like with many qualifications, when you make contact with reality, and you start your first job, you start to realize that things in the real world are actually very different. First of all, learner expectations tend to be calibrated towards the least efficacious ways of learning that they're absolutely used to by the time they reach you. Well, that's due to many factors. One of those being that English teaching has been created as this thing that's meant to be fun and involving lots of games, and tends to involve a lot of performative aspects of a lively, dynamic class, irrespective of whatever underlying learning might be taking place or might not be taking place, which we just kind of take for granted. So there are a hell of a lot of constraints on what you can and can't do that need to be overcome. And schools are obviously very political places. And in the macro sense, especially in Thailand, in the school system, you definitely get this implicit message from the culture that surrounds schools and learning that it's meant to be something heavily geared towards engineering good citizens in like a conformist mentality, all kind of hinged on the fact that Thai culture was superior and all those kind of things. And in my view, all that was very much antithetical to a sort of authentic approach and syllabus that demanded more of a sort of independent, engaged learner. I remember now that the mindset was that everything had to be fun, and if it wasn't fun, there was something wrong. And the most important thing was that the students liked you. Also, you probably know this, but in Thailand, no student is ever allowed to fail, and that goes across the country. And so because of that, and the students obviously are clearly aware of that, you do start to get the sense that teaching English is a bit of a charade and that people just have to do it reluctantly. And there was a distinct sort of lack of engagement generally in all the classes that I was involved with in Thailand. That's not to say that I'm necessarily blaming the students, because I think there's a lot more I could have done. But working in Thailand, I guess, for a variety of reasons, does leave you feeling very jaded. And this is deserving of its own video. Suffice to say, I think many Thailand-based teachers recognize that their teaching skills are atrophying. They're not growing, and doing a lot of harm to their long-term employability, because most people are aware of the Thai market. So for me, moving to Vietnam and kind of restarting my career in a new teaching context was a logical move, and I'm very glad that I made it. So eventually, I would say that sort of deep into my career, about 5 or 6 years, I developed this consciousness of the importance of what I was doing and how people were dependent on me and how little I knew and how little I was able to do. There was this sense of this bottomless pit of understanding that was required of you to really have a meaningful effect on lasting learning. And once I knew that, I couldn't really unknow that. And earlier in my career as well, just purely by chance, I was invited to a seminar with Dr. Stephen Krashen, who's actually the pioneer of second language acquisition research. So the seed was kind of planted early with me. But at the time, I mean, we're talking like 2008 here, I was very young and naive, and I wasn't really able to take too much away other than the importance of input, which I took a bit too literally. I tended to swamp my learners with a lot of input, thinking that they needed to be like completely immersed in the language, and then it would all just start happening, you know, sort of incidentally, irrespective of whatever the scope of the instruction objectives was meant to be. I just felt like if I kept talking and I kept providing input and repeating and buffering up with context, that everything would just kind of fall into place naturally in the long run. And it was a bit of a cop-out, really. However, I am immensely grateful for that early experience, because it was many years later that I started to do more reading and I started to understand how my teaching needed to fundamentally change. So during this kind of awakening, I found myself in a staff room in one of the leading girls' schools in Bangkok, where I worked for about 3 years. And I was surrounded by some really good people and good teachers. They had this growth mindset, you know, and it was a good sort of melting pot working environment. And I fed off that. And I was inspired by several of my colleagues to kind of go further, you know, understanding that teaching is a craft. It was something that needed to be constantly developed and worked on. I was barely scraping the surface of what there is to know about ELT teaching for the first sort of almost 10 years. I did a bunch of free online courses that the British Council used to run on FutureLearn. I'll leave some links in the notes for that. And I started reading more, and I started improving my craft, and I moved to some other employers that were more challenging, and got to improve my classroom management and sort of learner motivation understanding, and that really helped. But also looking at how fundamentally a unit of instruction needs to be sort of structured towards higher learning goals and engaging learners in the process of communicating far more frequently than I was. So I really have to thank those people that I worked with, that sat next to me, that basically sparked that sort of interest in me to go further and become better. Because I guess it snowballed to where I am today, where my enthusiasm has, in many cases in Vietnam, actually become a problem for those around me, who kind of, you know, typically a lot of teachers just want to check in and out, you know, do what's expected, go home and sort of, you know, have their social life or whatever. And I was unsettling a lot of people, because I was like constantly trying to improve the standards of how I'm teaching, and people around me was just like, oh, what about us, you know? So yeah, it caused me some problems in the beginning. Since Thailand, I've worked in the Middle East and several other countries in Asia. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, I settled in Vietnam. I became a teacher trainer for a publisher, which involved moving around Vietnam and Cambodia, giving PD seminars, things like that, but really with the aid of kind of selling textbooks underneath that. I worked for one of the top bilingual schools in Saigon. I was there for 5 years. 2 of those years, I was the head of the middle school English department. I got very deeply involved in curriculum reform, which involved putting acquisition principles into effect and focusing more on proficiency and learning to follow a kind of backward design process in designing units rather than lessons. And it seems to have gained a lot of traction. The school, the students, and the teachers have basically given positive feedback, and they're still developing that. It's years of iteration to get it to where it needs to be, but I'm really proud to have kind of played a part in that and got them on the right path. So that's definitely something I'd like to be sharing with more schools and teachers. Now, if I had a core belief about teaching, and to be fair, I have many, and a lot of people will view this as being a bit holier than thou and pious, and I get it, but eventually people do come around to this understanding. I could probably summarize it as follows. Teachers themselves need to exemplify all the values they are espousing. In other words, whatever you expect of them, you need to be modeling it yourself at all times, not just during instruction. And it could be really unpacked and interpreted in different ways, but it's a really important starting point for me to mention this. What I'm really getting at is the fact that students learn far more from you and who you are than exactly what you're teaching or what you want them to learn. So you yourself as a teacher need to, in many ways, demonstrate all those attributes that you expect from them. Otherwise, you're a bit of a hypocrite. However, I guess there's another reason that I'm pointing towards that, and that's just to highlight the fact that teaching and learning are two sides of the same coin. And as a teacher, you do have to be a consummate learner and constantly engaged in that process. Nothing is static unless it's becoming stagnant. Like if I was to ask you, how would you feel if you got to know that your students only cared about grades and ticking boxes and treating their education as a means to an end? Would you be happy with that? I would expect a lot of teachers would say no. And the reason I ask you that is because I kind of want to point to the opposite scenario, which is if you look at teachers that are only really interested in professional development for the sake of improved status, promotion, career advancement only, not for looking for a practical real world value that they can actually bring to their classes, then you can see how the teacher is very much modeling the thing that you would least desire in your students, because education is much more deeper and important than that. It's kind of a bit like getting qualifications. There's a bit of black belt syndrome when you imagine the karate practitioner that kind of finishes at black belt, when actually the foothills of their real potential, but they've gained their kind of superficial achievement that other people will recognize, and that's it. There's no more motivation to learn. So there's a bit of an equivalence with that, with ELT qualifications. What I want to lead to is my own sort of personal thesis of this episode, which is that you really don't have to get a Delta or an MA in TESOL or even a CELTA. What you need to do is acquire the reading list and do all that learning yourself to the extent that it's actually relevant to your teaching context. Everyone's at different places and tends to have different focus and interests. But there's the point. I mean, do you need to get these qualifications? Why not acquire the books, start integrating that knowledge continuously as part of your sort of regular routine? Just putting aside 30 minutes to an hour a day really builds up over time, and you start to deepen your knowledge and think more strategically about your teaching. So there's my tip. Acquire the reading list, easy enough to do, and then start looking at what sort of real improvements you can derive from that and directly enact. The qualification was never meant to be a means to an end, So yeah, that's my sort of soapbox sermonizing for now. If I can get into the deeper purpose of this channel, I really believe there's a lack of community when it comes to English teaching in Asia. People generally go about their jobs and they don't want to upset their employers. Speaking out is frowned upon, right? Even though schools promote critical thinking in their students. I've struggled personally to find a decent forum where I can interact with people and keep abreast of important things that your average teacher is way too busy to find the time researching when they're not working. I have discovered a few podcasts for teaching English as a language, or just teaching languages generally. I have to say I found a lot of them to be informative, but delivery quite difficult to get through, a bit goofy in their delivery, not very enjoyable to listen to, doesn't feel very real world, especially from the Asian context. So you have to listen and kind of trawl through these personalities that tend to be a bit self-referential and trying to be funny in a very dorky way. And yeah, I haven't really enjoyed those, but a few episodes on a few select podcasts I've gained a lot from. And aside from my other types of learning and research, I can listen to those for you and kind of apply them to the context in Asia in a way that makes more sense practically, having acknowledged the constraints that we have to work with. So I'd like to be able to kind of be a bit of a conduit for the community as a whole. A lot of the sort of ELT gurus, sort of talking heads on the sort of presentation circuit tend to be very like Europe-centric and dealing with small classes and language centers and sort of idealistic scenarios, in my opinion. In my view, they really come across as being very out of touch at the moment. And to be honest, I haven't found a single podcast or YouTube channel that comes close to the type of community and realism for fulfilling those urgent training and knowledge needs that your average teacher has right now in places like Vietnam. Hence, the need for this channel. It was a bit disheartening, to be honest, that there's so many sort of important people in the ELT world that I used to look up to, and they wrote a lot of the teacher training manuals too. They were renowned for being some of the biggest, most influential voices in the industry, and yet I can say conclusively, pretty much all of them are in bed with the publishing companies and diluting the message of best practice and not really adding anything new to driving the industry forward. And that's why I'm here. There aren't many people in this industry that you can really look up to as mentors. At least it's not obvious anyway. Global ELT world, let alone Asia. So I'd like to reveal some of those that are influential along the way. But there's obviously a huge gap for this type of conversation, and this is where I'd like to play my part. Aside from English, I want to appeal to a wider base of language teachers. I'm a student of Vietnamese and Thai, and I've worked with a lot of Vietnamese and Thai teachers over the years to develop my language. And I have to say, I've never met a teacher that has even the beginnings of the knowledge required to understand how language is learned and what effective pedagogy looks like. So it's been a bit of a frustrating process for me to sit there and having explored this knowledge in a language class, knowing that everything that's about to happen to me is going to have a very minimal impact, and I'm going to be a bit frustrated, but just try and be polite and respectful to the teacher, who's doing their best with what they have. More often than not, your average Vietnamese teacher or Thai language teacher is probably more concerned with building up their customer base and keeping their clients happy than going down the rabbit hole of exploring new methods and new understandings and depth about the mechanics of how language is learned and complicating matters. So this is why I want to widen the scope beyond teaching English, beyond Vietnam even, because I think the issues are all across Asia and kind of beyond English itself. I think we're looking at language teaching as a whole, and that's where my focus is going to be. I'd very much like to appeal to the language teacher generally, not just the ELT hack, if you like. So I want to reach out to anyone who's teaching any language in any teaching context in any part of Asia. I think we all have a lot to share and learn from each other. So what I'd like to be able to do for all you teachers out there in Asia is create a community and a conversation that we can all take part in that rises above the politics of education and this kind of commercialization of textbook-driven ELT that I mentioned earlier, and try and empower teachers to start loving their job in a completely new way. So obviously it's satisfying teaching young learners, I get that, and helping people in and of itself, to be sure, but to be engaged in the creative process of applying new principles and new pedagogy and creating that sort of learning pathway and learning to think like an assessor. Once you get there, it's very rewarding, very empowering, and you can really get into a flow of what you're doing and feel that you're having more of an impact. What I actually love is the process of looking at a lesson or unit and being completely lost at the beginning, not really having a clue what to do with it, and by the end of the session, actually having something coherent that I'm really happy with, that I think might work. Getting from that place to that place is one of the satisfying parts of the job. And it's really added a new dimension to how I enjoy teaching, because the more I put into planning, the more relaxing the lesson is, the more relaxed I am, the better everything feels. And I can basically be more involved as a facilitator and try and get some deeper learning going instead of reacting to things as they happen, which tends to be a result of poor planning, if we're honest. So we're going to look at every angle of this profession, which is what it is. Even if the market doesn't necessarily value it as such, it is a profession. We're going to build up some foundational knowledge on second language acquisition so we can start understanding the process of how languages are actually learnt. Then we can start thinking about re-examining our approach. And it doesn't mean that we can change everything overnight. The likelihood is that we'll have to make a lot of compromises. But to create pockets of authentic learning within a system that we know is probably not respecting the fundamentals of second language acquisition research. Let's be honest. So we all have to keep our jobs, but there's a lot we can do to improve the efficacy of what we do, even if we are working within a flawed system with imperfect departments, students, and leadership. Believe me, I feel you. I've been there. So at this point, we're getting quite a way in. I realize I'm giving you an immense sort of lecture speech. This is not really how the episodes are supposed to run. But I wanted to set the tone. I wanted you to know who I am and what I'm about. And I really hope that you can follow and participate. I'd really like to take my lead from the teachers themselves. I hope you have a great year teaching ahead, and I'm really looking forward to putting out some quality content going forward. Please like and subscribe. Tell us where you have disagreements. Tell me what questions you have. Give me the inputs necessary to provide more relevant and helpful content. Okay? Let's see how this goes. Thanks again.